A young officer and his wife sit in their car at the dock and stare quietly at the waiting aircraft carrier before he leaves for Korea. San Diego, California, 1950. Singer Paul Robeson addresses a hands-off Korea rally from a sound truck at the corner of 126th Street and Lenox Avenue in the Harlem section of New York, on July 3, 1950. A command post somewhere in South Korea on July 12, 1950, as American soldiers keep on the alert with their straw-covered camouflaged weapons carrier.
The Korean War, 1950–1953, known as the Forgotten War in the United States. On June 25, 1950, 100,000 North Korean troops crossed over the border and invaded the South, starting the war. The next day, President Truman authorized U.S. troops to defend the South. The Korean War began as a civil war, but soon became international when, under U.S. leadership, the United Nations joined to support South Korea, and the People's Republic of China entered to aid North Korea. After 1876, Korea became the object of rivalry among competing colonial powers. Japan and Russia went to war, and Japan came out as the victor, and controlled Korea until 1945. The decision to divide Korea was the result of an agreement made between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the final stages of World War II. After Japan surrendered, Soviet troops entered the northern tip of Korea, which prompted the United States to take action. On May 1948, the South established the rep point of Korea. Syngman re-elected president. By 1948, the United States and the Soviet Union had pulled most of their troops out of Korea.
Tank landing ships unload at Incheon on September 15, 1950. American forces landed in Incheon harbor one day after Battle of Incheon began. Troops of the 31st Infantry Regiment land at Incheon Harbor, Korea, aboard LSDs on September 18, 1950. A U.S. Marine, Wright, orders captured North Koreans to keep their hands up on September 20, 1950. In the background is one of the tanks which came ashore in the assault at Incheon. A U.S. Marine tank follows a line of prisoners of war down a village street. September 26, 1950.
With the sudden collapse of the Japanese Empire, the U.S. realized there was nothing to stop the Soviet Union from taking over the entire country and creating another Soviet satellite. U.S. troops went into the South, and a plan was presented to create two separate occupational zones. Korea was then divided at the 38th. The dividing line was an arbitrary decision, chosen because it conveniently divided the nation in half on a map. As mentioned before, on June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The South was taken by surprise and quickly overrun. The capital Seoul was captured within 3 days. The invasion prompted Washington to quickly change its policy toward Asia. Truman authorized a naval blockade and airstrikes south of the border in support of the South. It was reported that the South Koreans would be defeated in weeks without U.S. help. Truman approved the request for ground troops the following day. Task Force Smith was sent in to stop the North's advance until the rest of the army could be sent. But it was only able to delay them for 7 hours before being completely routed. U.S. and South Korean forces were eventually driven all the way back to the southeastern city of Busan, the port city where they had originally landed. Troops regrouped and established a defensive line called the Busan Perimeter around the cities of Daegu and Busan. With the help of air power, UN forces were able to hold the line. Once MacArthur was assured the Busan Perimeter was stable, he proposed a daring landing at the western port city of Incheon. It was far behind the enemy lines and if successful, it would cut the North's army in half.
Paratroopers dropped from U.S. Air Force C-119 transport planes during an operation over an undisclosed location in Korea, in October of 1950. Captured by American forces in the Daegu area of South Korea on October 8, 1950, these North Korean girls are marched to a train which will take them to a prisoner of war camp at Busan. A long winding stream of Korean refugees board a vessel in Hungnam Harbor, North Korea on December 21, 1950, as they flee the advancing Chinese Communists and North Koreans. American GIs thread their way over snow-covered hills north of Seoul, South Korean capital on January 14, 1951, during earlier stages of UN withdrawal.
It was risky, because it required precise timing. The channel access to the port was narrow and inaccessible at low tide. It was a strategy that MacArthur had successfully employed during World War II, being where the enemy aimed. It worked exactly as he had hoped. The North were surprised, so there were only 174 Allied casualties. After a week of intense fighting, The battered Northern Army fled north in retreat. By September, UN forces had recaptured Seoul and the northern troops had been driven back over the border. The UN had achieved its original goal of repelling the invaders. The US had actually considered reunifying the country since the beginning of the war. MacArthur was granted permission to cross the 38th, but was limited from entering the northeast region of the country. Truman didn't want to risk border clashes that could provoke China or the Soviet Union. UN forces crossed the border and quickly captured 3 coastal cities and the North Korean capital of Pyongyang by October. China had warned the US against advancing any farther. Mao Zedong had made it clear that he would not tolerate an enemy state so close to his border. The US dismissed the threat as a bluff, but that cost them for misjudging the situation. A large number of troops from Manchuria went across the Yalu River in mid-October. They were able to enter Korea undetected.
Bomber Command planes of the U.S. Far East Air Forces rained tons of high demolition bombs on a strategic military target of the Chinese Communists in North Korea on January 18, 1951. A pair of bound hands and a breathing hole in the snow at Yangji, Korea, January 27, 1951 reveal the presence of the body of a Korean civilian shot and left to die by retreating communists during the Korean War. A UN soldier, left, stands guard at prisoner of war enclosure where a great mass of communist troops line up after their capture somewhere in Korea on March 21, 1951. 3 Korean communists in a fishing boat are captured by the USS Manchester off the coast of Korea on May 10, 1951.
They attacked UN forces, but then suddenly withdrew back into the mountains. Some historians believe it was a warning to the UN. In November, the Chinese attacked with over 300,000 men. They completely outnumbered the UN forces, so they were driven back in a 300-mile retreat, the longest in US history. MacArthur stated, "We face an entirely new war." He added that the UN forces didn't have enough manpower to meet the new Chinese threat. MacArthur recommended using the nationalist troops offered by Chiang Kai-shek to reinforce the UN units and to launch attacks on the Chinese mainland. Washington found it too dangerous that could lead to a war with the Soviet Union. Truman had no choice but to relieve MacArthur of his command, and appoint General Matthew Ridgway as his successor. America still considered MacArthur a hero. Ridgway was brought in at the end of 1950 and was able to restore morale and make organizational changes that improved his army. The UN reclaimed much of the ground they had lost and established a strong defensive line. The Korean War did not get much media attention in the United States. Acting as an intermediary, Jacob Malik, the Soviet delegate to the UN, hinted that a peace settlement might be possible. Truman authorized Ridgway to contact the enemy and arrange a meeting. Both sides agreed to meet at the Keesong, south of the 38th.
With her brother on her back, a war-weary Korean girl trudges by a stalled M26 tank at Hangju, Korea. On June 9, 1951. Supply warehouses and dock facilities at this East Coast port explode after parademolition bombs were dropped from the 5th Air Force's B-26 Invader light bombers. Wonsan, North Korea, 1951. American combatants captured during the Korean War marched down a street. Crew members of a Marine battery launcher hold their ears and crouch to the ground as rockets are fired into the night sky.
The Communists broke off negotiations entirely because of an alleged UN violation of the ceasefire zone that surrounded Keesong. The peace talks resumed in October and the negotiations were productive and resulted in the settlement of most of the problems. A new border established between North and South Korea. The Communists wanted their prisoner of wars back, but the problem was the 50,000 prisoner of wars didn't want to return home. The Communists agreed to a compromise, which allowed prisoner of wars who didn't want to return to live in a neutral country. In November 1952, Dwight David Eisenhower became the new president of the U.S. In April 1953, after Stalin's death, Stalin's successor stated that the Soviet Union and the U.S. could settle disputes peacefully. The treaty was signed on July 27, 1953 by the U.S., China, and North Korea. South Korean Presidentry had been opposed to any kind of negotiations from the beginning, and refused to sign, which has officially left the two Koreas still divided today. All foreign troops were completely withdrawn from Korea. The two Koreas remained politically and ideologically divided, and hostile toward each other. North Korea and China claimed victory, and earned a world respect for matching the military might of the U.S. North Korea retains its hardline communist traditions. The war was one of the bloodiest, and resulted in 4 million military and civilian casualties. The Korean War Veterans Memorial was made in Washington, D.C.
F-9 F-2 floating on water after crash over bow of USS Philippines Sea, CV-47, near Korea. Commander R. Weymouth stands on the nose of the plane awaiting rescue. Lieutenant R. P. Yeatman, from the USS Bonhomme Richard, rocketing and bombing a Korean bridge in November of 1952. North Korean combatants plunged together with the tank unit in Seoul during the Korean War. The 1st Division Marines land at a seawall, far behind the lines of the Communist forces, during the landing at Incheon. Tanks of the 1st Marine Tank Battalion barked death and devastation into the briefly daylighted Korean night, as Marines fire a night mission at supply installations somewhere in Korea on January 16, 1952. South Korean women weep as they listen to President Syngman Rhee speak at a memorial service in Seoul, October 17, 1953. The service honored the 33,964 South Koreans killed in the last year of the war.